Well, good morning. As always, it is good to be with you all. I appreciate the encouragement following my last lesson that you all gave me, and that many of you were encouraged by it. As I told many of you, I don't mind crying in front of people, but it's really hard to just talk when you're crying, and so that was the only frustration I had in trying to give that lesson. But I'm glad that it was encouraging and that you will feel emboldened from the recent events and from that lesson to share your faith with others. Today, we were finally finishing the relationship section in Colossians. I had intended that to be one lesson, 3:18 through 4:1. And as I said, when I got to that I realized if I was going to offer any helpful, practical suggestions in relationships, it was going to take me a lot longer than a single lesson. So I decided to look at each of these relationships that all in some way relate to and represent our relationship to God. Each of these are relationships God has created and to help us understand Him. That He created the marriage relationship to help us understand our relationship to Him. He created parent-child relationships to help us understand our relationship to Him. And He's created the master-slave relationship, the employer-employee relationship to help us understand Him. And that's the way you should be thinking about it. In our modern world, technically, and I say this intentionally, slavery is illegal. And I say that because people still kidnap others and force them into situations that are immoral. But legally, throughout most of the world, it's not legal to own slaves the way it used to be. And that was the case for humans for a long, long time. Slavery is an ancient practice. But not all forms of slavery looked exactly like the most recent versions from the 1800s in America that we are probably most familiar with. And there were some slave master relationships that were quite similar to employer-employee relationships. That, in fact, many slaves in the time Paul's writing this became slaves because they got into debt and they sold themselves into slavery to help pay off that debt. It was a financial decision because they didn't have the money to pay everyone back. And so applying this to our modern employee-employee relationships is appropriate and the most relatable situation to draw from. One thing that's interesting in this section is Paul spends more time on the relationship of the slave to the master, the employee to the employer, than any of the other ones. And this is where you get most of the passages that remind us that this is not separate from what he was just talking about at the end of 3:17, where he says, everything you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of Jesus. He brings it up in 3:18 and 3:20 and 3:22. The highlighted ones here, the orange ones, are the ones coming from the text we're focused on today, that we're to serve as if we're fearing the Lord, as if serving Jesus himself. It's actually Jesus we're serving in our slave to master, employee to employer relationships. And then he reminds the masters of 4:1, you have a master in heaven. But he spends more time on the employee relationship. And I think one of the reasons he does that is you don't have to get married. That's an option God gives us. That each person that he creates, he gives them the freedom to marry a spouse, but he does not force them to. And you don't have to have children. So those relationships may or may not be things that we experience while we are here. But everyone is either going to be a boss or be an employee at some point in your life, unless you're a trust fund baby, and I don't think that we have any of those here. So all of us are going to be in this situation one way or the other. And that's probably why I think he spends more time thinking about this, and most of us are going to be in the employee relationship versus the master relationship on the average. I think that's probably why he spends more time thinking about that than anything else in this paragraph or section he talks about with relationships. And we won't spend too much time focused on that because we've kind of hammered this point with marriage and with parents and children, that all of these relationships for the Christian are seen through the lens that this is for Jesus, that this is for my King. And how would he want me to be as a spouse, as a child, as a parent, as an employee, as an employer through that lens? Won't really hammer that a whole lot, and we'll just jump right into what Paul tells us. As we're seeking to serve primarily Jesus, he says, okay, here's how you're going to do that. Here's the instruction I have for you. So slaves, employees, obey your masters, obey your bosses in everything. Very, very similar to what he tells the children, obeying the children, or obeying your parents in everything. And of course, and we'll make this point in a few minutes again, but of course, God's rules, God's expectations, God's morality always trumps the desires and instructions of your parent, of your master. So your master goes to tell you to commit a crime. Of course, you say no, that's wrong. But assuming we're not talking about something in direct opposition to God's expectation, he says, slaves, obey your masters in everything. Whether it seems reasonable or not, whether you want to do it or not, you obey them in everything. And there's three qualifying statements he offers that we're going to unpack. The first one he says is you're not going to do this with eye service as men pleasers. Now, for many of you, that might be self-explanatory. But in case you're like, okay, what does he mean by eye service? What does he mean by men please? Let's unpack that a little bit. In simple terms, he's simply saying that you're going to do a good job as an employee. You're going to do a good job as a slave, whether your master or your boss or your manager is watching you or not. That you, while you're on the job, you're going to give the best you can do on whatever particular job with the resources you have been given. And one of the hard things and one of the rationalizations we give to ourselves is we look at our bosses, and whether it's because they're cheap or whether because they don't have the money, they don't give us the proper tools to do the job we ought to do. They don't give us the proper resources. They don't give us the proper time. Paul does not say, do this as long as all your caveats are fulfilled. As long as your boss is actually giving you everything you need to do. He said, no. You're going to do this not for eye service and not as men pleasers. You're going to do a good job, regardless of the reasonableness or regardless of the natural effectiveness of that. And you're going to do that whether people are watching or not. And you can expand this to say it this way too. You're going to do a good job even if no one will know. I'll give an illustration of something that I don't think, again, if you're in construction, let me know if I'm incorrect about this. But if you ever open up a wall of a new build, you're going to find all kinds of things inside that wall. You're going to find sawdust, you're going to find wrappers, you're going to find screws, you're going to find nails. Now, I don't think that actually damages the house. I don't think there's any serious consequences by leaving that stuff inside the wall. And they do that. Why? Because no one's ever going to know until they open up that wall. No one's going to see it. And as far as I know, it doesn't cause any damage. So I don't personally have a big problem with it. But if you ever open the wall and it is spick and span and clean and there's nothing left there, then that person apparently cared about doing it as the best job they could in that, regardless of whether anyone would know about it. This is the idea that Paul is giving the slaves. Slaves, you're not doing this to be seen by people. You're not doing a good job just so people will recognize you and praise you. You're not doing this just to please men. And that's because you don't care about the praise of men. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned about how people see us, whether we are a good reflection of God or not. There are many passages that call us to do that. But he says, listen, this is not, you're not going to do a good job, slaves, for your next promotion. You're not going to do a good job so that you get a pay raise. You're not going to do a good job so that at the next business meeting you're going to get Employee of the Month. That's not the motivation. Those things aren't bad. But he's saying, Christian, as an employee, as a slave, you're not going to do this just because you want men to praise you. You're not a man pleaser. Your focal point is on Jesus. Your focal point is on the King. That's who you're trying to please. That's who you're trying to serve. It's his recognition that matters. And it's so easy because the world tells you to do the opposite of these things. The world says, well, if he's not going to give you all the resources, well, that's his fault. And I will acknowledge that there are situations where you can't take a hand shovel and dig through granite. It's not going to work. So, you can beat that rock, but it's not going to budge very much. So there might be a limit in what you can do. But you're going to do the best job you can, whether you're being watched or whether people are going to praise you or not. Because that's not the way you think. You think differently. The world says, take as much time as you possibly can. If no one's watching, you do what you want. You do it your way. And if they will not praise you, then you just stop trying. Paul says, Christian, you're going to do the opposite of all of that. So this is first thing. So you're not going to do this for eye service. You're not going to do this as men pleasers. In addition to that, he says, you're actually going to work with sincerity of heart as if you're working for Jesus. There's going to be a genuineness to your actions. There's going to be a genuine desire to benefit your employer. He says that with sincerity, you're serving this person as if you're serving Jesus. Which means, do I want Jesus' kingdom to grow? Do I want it to flourish? Do I want God to accomplish his work in people's lives? I assume everyone here would say yes, of course. Well, he says, if that's the attitude I have to Jesus, that's the kind of attitude I should have from my boss or from my master. That I want their company to succeed. I want them to be successful. I want the customer to be satisfied by the work we do. I have a genuine desire to benefit the master. He says, have sincerity of heart when you're doing your work. Christian, that's how you're going to think. That's how you're going to act. That's not the way the world thinks. The world says I'm only in it for myself. I'm only in it for my benefit. And I don't care what influence it has, what impact it has on my boss, on my job. I'm only here for myself. Now, don't misunderstand me. It is easy in our world to make our job, our career, our financial successes a god, to make them idols. God always comes first. And if it's ever between choosing God's things and your work things, you choose God's things. But he's saying in the job, when you're on the job, whatever that is, whether it's a 9 to 5 or for the slave, 24/7, when you're given that job, you work with sincerity of heart, as if you're working for Jesus. We often say things like this, that one of the reasons, and don't misunderstand me, I've not always had great bosses, so I understand, and not all of you have great bosses. People are people, and they're fallible, and they're human, and they have faults. And so when the boss does not recognize you, when he does not appreciate you, when he overworks you, when he's not fair, it is natural to become bitter. And that bitterness to then affect the work we do. And what he's saying is you're going to overrule the natural bitterness you're inclined to develop as a human with grace. We often say things like that, that's the point I was getting to in just a second ago, that we can imagine, like, if Jesus was my boss, I wouldn't have a problem with this. If Jesus was my spouse, or if Jesus was my parent, I wouldn't have a problem submitting and obeying and doing what Jesus said. Because he's perfect. He doesn't make mistakes. He's perfectly fair. He's perfectly just. He is always going to do the right thing. So if I was in these shoes actually serving Jesus, of course I could do this. Well, that Jesus is telling us to work with sincerity of heart for those masters. Just recently encouraging someone, they were talking about this. If Jesus was my spouse, then of course I could follow them. It's like, well, that Jesus told you to love and respect your spouse. And my point of highlighting this is we think that if it's Jesus in the shoes of the other person, we suddenly would have a much easier time doing what we're supposed to be doing. And what I'm suggesting to you, we probably wouldn't. It'd probably be just as hard, because that Jesus is telling us to do these things, and I expect most of us, as we think about these texts and imagine applying these texts, are like, whoa, that's really hard. It's really hard to always do a good job when no one's watching, when no one will know. It's hard to do a good job when the master doesn't appreciate their work. It seems to always ask more and more, and nothing's ever good enough. But Paul is saying, Christian, you're going to decide to overrule the natural bitterness, the natural resentment, the natural selfishness that humans have with grace and compassion. That's how you're going to work as an employee. And as you do that, if you're working with sincerity of heart, a genuine concern for your boss, for your employee, for your employer, then you don't just want him to succeed physically, you want that. You don't just want him to be profitable, you want that. You want him, most importantly, to develop spiritually. Because the value of God and the value of salvation is incomparable to any amount of money or success or accolades anyone could ever accomplish in the physical world and the financial world. Employees, as a Christian, you are more concerned about the spiritual being of your boss than any physical accomplishments. It's not that you aren't concerned. Paul's making it very clear. You're working for their benefit. You want to benefit them. But as you do that, and one of the reasons to do that is you want their spiritual benefit. The better employee you are, the more likely, doesn't guarantee it, but the more likely your boss is willing to listen to you when you do bring up God and you do bring up spiritual things. Here's one of the reasons to do a good job as an employee, because you're trying to create the smoothest path you possibly can to introduce Jesus to that person. And that's one of the primary ways you're serving Jesus in your job, is so that you're trying to make that road as smooth and straight as you possibly can, so you can then bring Jesus into the picture and create the greatest opportunity for that person to come to know Jesus. The third thing that he says in describing this obeying in everything. My version and the version that Mike read was heartily, you're serving heartily. And I think that's perfectly fine translation. On the scale of 1 to 10, on the intensity of work, 10 being high and 1 being low, I think of heartily somewhere around an 8, 8.5. But a more literal translation of this phrase is actually from the soul. And I want to point that out because for me, from the soul ratchets it up a couple levels. Heartily 8, 8.5. From the soul is a 10 plus. There's an intensity that he is giving or calling for in the Christian, that you're going to serve with sincerity of heart, and you're going to serve from your soul. And again, reminder, it's easy in our world for a job to become a god, to become an idol, and so we have to be careful of that and balance that. But while I'm on the job, whether it's 8 to 5 or 10 to 7 or whatever, while I'm on the job, I'm going to work from my soul. I'm going to pour intensity into my work because I'm trying to benefit my master and benefit the company and to be as if I'm serving Jesus himself. Because that's one of the phrases where this shows up, where it says you're going to work from your soul as if you're serving the Lord himself. That you're going to do the best job you can with the resources you have. And this is not to say that this is one of the distinctions we live with versus the people he's primarily writing to when he writes this. One of the things that was true, slaves could not just get up and leave. They might be in a more employee-employee relationship, but one thing that was absolutely true is they did not have the freedom to leave the working relationship. We live in a country that you have that. In fact, most states in our country are what's called at-will employer-employee states, meaning your employer can fire you for any reason, but you can also quit for any reason. Now, again, some of us sign contracts, some of us have some legal binding obligation when we take a job, but most jobs are at will, meaning you can walk away. And so when we say you're working from the soul, we're not saying you can't ever leave a job, especially because you have the freedom to. But the question we should be asking ourselves as Christians is first off, as long as I'm in this job, is this the way I'm acting? Am I working from the soul? Am I working with sincerity of heart? Am I working in a way to not please men, but to please God? Not just for eye service, but because I'm trying to do the best job I can in the job. As long as I'm in that job, that's how I'm going to work, if I'm going to be a Christian that listens to God. But there might be a job that's better for the kingdom. There might be a job, whether it's an increase in pay and resources or increase in freedom of time or increase fill in the blank, that makes you a better asset in God's kingdom. You see that language actually in 1 Corinthians 7 when Paul's talking to slaves and he's saying, listen, it's okay if you're a slave. Don't stress out. You can serve God in that situation, in that circumstance. You can follow God and be useful in his kingdom. But he says in the next verse, but if you can get free, get free. You can be more resourceful. You have greater freedom to serve in God's kingdom if you're free versus being a slave. And so don't misunderstand me that when I bring up these things, we're not saying that you're in the job you're in, you got to stay there and should never change. But I should always be asking, when I'm looking at the change, does it serve the kingdom? Does it serve Jesus? In what job, what situation, what place can I serve my king the best? Because that's who I'm serving. And so I'm always asking, what is Jesus' desires and goals? And there will be times what Jesus wants you to do will conflict with what your company, with what your boss wants you to do. It may not be legal issues, though that can arise. It might be other things. And so Jesus does always trump your master's desires. And the way you help figure that out is asking what is in the best interest of God's kingdom, of Jesus' kingdom. Before we wrap up this kind of how to obey in everything, I want to draw your attention to this verse. And I'm not alluding to it already, but in 1 Peter 2, verse 18, another passage about servants and masters. The servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are harsh. I gotta say this, first couple years I was here with some of the college kids, and we got to this part of 1 Peter, and they're like, that's hard. Yeah, it is. Because he doesn't just say, do this if your master is kind, do this if your master is reasonable, do this if your master is understandable. He says, no, he specifically calls out, and it's clearly implied in the Colossians, but he clearly states it explicitly here in 1 Peter. He says, listen, you're going to act this way. If you are a Christian, if you're going to follow God's instructions, you're going to live this way, even if your master is harsh. You're not just going to serve the interest of those who are gentle. You're not just going to work heartily for those who are gentle. You're not just going to have a sincere heart for those who are gentle. You're going to have that for masters who are harsh too. And as you contemplate that, it's very reasonable to ask, how in the world do you do that? How do you have the emotional, mental, spiritual strength to say, okay, yes, I'm going to do that? Well, he actually gives you 3 reasons in this text. Like I said, he spends way more time on this section than the other relationships. He gives us 3 reasons. The first reason, which he repeats repeatedly, is remember, you are serving Jesus. You're doing this not for your master's sake primarily. You're doing this not even for your own sake primarily. You're doing it first and foremost primarily for Jesus. And so the question to ask yourself, when you're in the situation, you got a job, your boss does not appreciate you, he's not fair, he's not reasonable, you ask yourself, do I love Jesus? Do I trust Jesus? If I love and I trust Jesus, that Jesus said, here's how you're going to be in that job. Here's how you're going to act. Here's how you're going to work. And you do it first and primarily because you love and you trust Jesus. That's his first reason, his first motivation. The second one is, I want you to understand, guys. Jesus who sees you doing this, regardless of whether this ever impacts your master, whether you ever convert your employer, whether he ever changes and begins to recognize and appreciate you, even if that never happens, Jesus sees what you're doing, and he will reward you. He appreciates what you're doing. He sees that you're trusting him. He sees you're following him. He sees that you're living for him, whether your master sees it or not. And he will reward you in the inheritance. Another way to say this is, there is no sacrifice we will ever make in serving Jesus. There is no humbling, humiliating choice we do in seeking to obey God that we will not feel fully satisfied for in the reward of the inheritance. So whether you ever get what is just and fair and due here, Jesus will reward you. That's his second reason. His third reason, a little more sticky than carroty, is that, oh, by the way, and if you do wrong, if you steal from your employer by stealing time or resources or not actually doing the job you should be doing, you will face consequences for that. Whether that's physical consequences and, more importantly, spiritual consequences. He says, there's a parable Jesus tells about the man who, basically summarizing, he commits a crime, and he says, you won't get out until you pay the last cent. Like, there are physical consequences here, but the more important ones are the spiritual consequences. God wants you in heaven with him. He wants you a part of his family, and he doesn't want to say, be gone from me, I don't know who you are. But if I hate my master and loathe my master, and I am lazy and a cheat, and I remain unrepentant of those things, and I steal from my master, whether it's by stealing his resources or actually stealing time, whatever it is, God will one day say, you didn't trust me, you didn't believe me, I don't know who you are. Ending this section, I want to end with 1 Peter 2, 19 and 20. Trevor referenced this in his sermon last week. This is where he says, for this finds favor, if for the sake of conscience toward God, a person endures grief when suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. This is a challenging verse for me because I'll tell you, my intuition, my natural reaction, when someone does something they shouldn't do, commits some kind of crime or sin, and they are patient when rebuked and patient when they receive some kind of judgment or justice, I have a tendency to want to commend them for that. I think there's a general sentiment we have in the West. I could be wrong. Maybe it's just projecting my feelings on others. And yet what this text says is there's no commendation for that. If you're patient when you've committed a crime and you patiently accept and graciously accept the judgment you receive, that's what you're supposed to do. You don't get brownie points for that. That's what this text says. It's against my intuition. Again, one of many places where you can go to Scripture, at least for me, and say, just because it's intuitively the case doesn't mean it is the case. Because my intuition is like, well, I kind of feel like you should praise the person for being patient. But no. You're supposed to be patient when you receive judgment against crimes you've committed. It's when you've not done any crimes. It's when you're being treated unjustly that then you suffer patiently and then you suffer compassionately and graciously that this finds favor with God. And so if we have employers, if we have masters who are not just and fair and reasonable, and they treat us unfairly, it's when we're gracious in those situations that finds favor with God. And that's what our Lord and Master Jesus has asked us to do in serving him. Now, jumping over to masters, he's much brief. Of course, we're mastering for our master. We'll talk more about that on the last slide. But he has a single verse, and he basically has one instruction to masters. He says, masters, you need to grant your slaves, bosses, you need to grant your employees justice and fairness. Now, again, maybe somewhat self-explanatory you are, but let's unpack that a little bit. What might that look like? Well, you're going to treat your employees, you're going to treat your slaves equally. You're just not going to play favorites. If you have a job, whether that's cleaning the workroom or whatever it may be, if it's the same job, you have the same expectations. If employee A or slave A is expected to do X, Y, and Z, then slave B is expected to do X, Y, and Z when they do that job. And it says, masters, you don't play favorites. You expect the same things of the slaves, depending on no matter the situation. Another situation where this might come up is maybe there's a dispute, or there's an argument, or there's an allegation of some wrongdoing or some failure to do something that was supposed to be done. Well, as a master, as a boss, you're going to seek to judge fairly in those disputes. It doesn't matter if it's your son or daughter. It doesn't matter if it's your best friend who is the one who apparently made the mistake. Whatever the consequences are the consequences. And you treat them fairly. I realize most people here are not in the master situation. You're not in the boss situation. But this does apply to any kind of situation where we end up in charge or end up in some kind of authority. These ideas or these attitudes God wants us to have. It also might look like recognizing that we need to have reasonable expectations for others. One way this shows up is And it can be really hard as the boss, especially if you're the owner of the company. It's a small company, you own the company. This is really, really hard because the company's a part of you. Like there's an emotional attachment to your company that you've started and you have worked for days, weeks, years, sleepless nights, right? There's an emotional investment there. And the benefit of the company is a benefit to you. But let's imagine you're not the boss. You're not the owner. The only benefit you get is the paycheck at the end of the week. But that's your only connection, the only reason you're here. Okay, assuming in that situation, you start asking, okay, what's the golden rule? How would I want to be treated in that situation? How would I want to be compensated? So, for instance, you ask yourself questions like, well, what would it take for me, not connected to the company, no other benefit to me other than just a paycheck, what would it take for me to do this job? I'll tell this story. So up on our hill behind Menards, the ground up there is pretty bad. When it's dry, it's like cement. When it's wet, it's like quicksand. It's just not good dirt. But when we first moved in, I really wanted to build a fence, so the girls had a place to play and I could send them outside and they'd be safe. Well, I didn't have the money to pay, but I talked to my neighbor. My neighbor had someone build their fence. It cost $10,000, and I'm like, I don't got that kind of money to have someone build a fence. I guess I have to do this myself. The worst job of that whole project was simply digging the holes. Once the holes were dug, it wasn't so bad. But I learned on that job, you could not pay me enough to be a permanent fence builder. There's no amount of money you could give me to do that all the time. And so I don't even fault the people for charging $10,000. Maybe they should have charged more. I just don't have the money to pay you that. As a boss, as a master, we should be asking, okay, what would I compensate myself? What would I think would be reasonable for me to do this job? And that should be part of your calculus. Now realize as a boss, you have limited funds. You don't have all the money in the world. You can't pay everyone infinite dollars. But you at least think through that. Say, what would be fair and reasonable? What would I want? How would I want to be treated? A similar kind of point is, okay, so what kind of compensation would I think I would be fair? What kind of time spent is reasonable? And again, this is more nuanced because some people are skilled, some people are brand new. And so you don't expect the brand new person to be able to do the job as fast as the other person, especially if we do a good job. And I'll go ahead and throw this point up here because it relates. Like, you have to understand, while it's the same job, same expectations, you understand the 18-year-old coming out of high school is probably not going to have the same skill set. He's been doing the job for 10 years, 20 years. And so you don't have the same expectations necessarily, especially on time frame. Because I'm sure many of you have been in positions in your jobs where your boss says, I need this tomorrow, I need this next week. And you're like, that's not reasonable. I can't do that. When you're in that position, and sometimes it's their fault, and sometimes it's not their fault. Sometimes something happened and there's a crisis, and you have to try to figure out how to plug the hole of the sinking ship. But as much as possible, as masters and bosses, you say, okay, what's reasonable for time expectations, and what's reasonable for this person with where they're at, with their skill set, with their emotional ability, with their physical ability, with their mental ability. What can they do reasonably? And maybe they can't do the job, and maybe you need to bring in someone else who can do the job. But that's part of the kinds of questions you'll be asking as a master. Now, he ends that verse by saying, remembering your master in heaven, knowing that you too have a master in heaven. And so, as a master, as a steward of resources, what kinds of questions would I ask as the boss, as the master of the slaves? Well, I probably start saying, okay, so what benefits my master? What benefits Jesus? What benefits his kingdom? How can I steward the resources he's given me to the best interest of what he's trying to accomplish? Maybe I can be hiring and employing other Christians, giving them a job so that they can put food on the table, a roof over their heads. Maybe I can be using resources to support evangelists or evangelism locally or around the world. And you could also throw that into using resources to help benevolence with Christians or helping train other Christians, giving them resources and equipment so they can grow spiritually and serve in God's kingdom better. There's all kinds of things you could put there. I just don't have enough space on my slide to squeeze it in. But you're asking these questions, okay, like, how can I benefit my master? He says, remember, you have a master in heaven. And one of the things that I think he's getting across to his audience here is, remember, those slaves are creations of God. And more than that, they're brethren, most likely in the case he's writing. And God cares about how you treat his creations. God cares about how you treat his children. And you're going to have to answer to that master one day. But in addition, the master should be pondering these things as a Christian. But we should notice something about these questions. These really aren't primarily master questions. These are slave questions. These are the kinds of attitudes and the kinds of mindsets that Paul spends so much time in the previous paragraph covering. And that's because he says, you have a master in heaven. So masters, I know you're in charge of these people, you have these slaves, you have these employees, but you have a master. There's a couple of verses I want to share before fleshing out this point. Romans 6, verse 16. Do you not know that the one to whom you present yourself as slaves for obedience, you are slaves of that same one whom you obey, either of sin resulting in death, or of obedience resulting in righteousness? He says, listen, you're either going to be a slave of sin and death, or you're going to be a slave of righteousness and life. Exodus 21, verse 5 and 6. This is one of the places where he's talking about slave laws in the Old Covenant. And in general, if you were a Jewish slave, every 7 years you're supposed to be released, regardless of what the situation is, what the debt is. And again, as a Jew, you could sell yourself into slavery for debt reasons. So every 7 years, there's supposed to be a freeing of the slaves. However, here's a situation where the slave doesn't want to leave. He doesn't want to go and be a free man. In verse 5 it says, but if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not leave as a free man. Then his master shall bring him to God, then he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him permanently. I don't know how many of you guys know the song, Pierce My Ear. It's not any of the books we have. But it's a reference to this. And it's connected to the Father. It's connected to God. It's a song about wanting to commit yourself totally and entirely to your Creator. And it comes from this picture that there are situations where the slave doesn't want to be a free man. He loves his master. He loves his master's household. He wants to spend the rest of his life benefiting his master. So here's the point we're getting at. As he tells masters, you have a master. Not you might have a master. You can have a master. You have a master. And so we don't get to choose to be slaves or not. That's not a choice as humans we get to make. We only get to choose to whom we will be slaves to, whom we will serve. That's the question that Joshua asks all the way back in Joshua 24, is the point that Jesus makes about mammon and God. You can't serve two masters. The Bible is full of this language. We don't get to choose to be a slave or not. We only get to choose who gets to be our master. And God wants us to choose him. He wants us to be like the Egyptians in the story of Joseph. You look at Joseph after they've had to sell their land and their cattle and their houses and their very selves throughout the famine. And the response of the people, they're now slaves. The response of the people to Joseph is celebration and joy because Joseph saved them. And Joseph is a shadow of Jesus. He wants us to love our master. And that's probably one of the reasons why Paul spends so much time on the slave section. Because in connection to God, in relation to God, that's the role we play. And he wants us to be slaves who love our master, who commit ourselves entirely to him with everything we have, who serve heartily, who with sincerity from the heart, not as with eye service as men pleasers. Jesus died so that we could have the opportunity to be in his family, to be his children, to be his servants. And he wants us to give ourselves to that work. And if you are ready to commit to being a servant, a slave of Jesus, we're ready to help him wash you clean in the waters of baptism. So you can repent of the sins and you can confess your faith in him. So you can be raised to walk a new life serving his kingdom. And if you have done that and you need counsel or guidance, or Satan has convinced you to be lazy and to avoid the work you ought to be doing, and you need guidance or wisdom or encouragement or people to poke you with sticks to keep you to do what you ought to do, let us know. If there's any way we can help you spiritually, let us know as we stand and as we sing. Have thine own way.